Picture a city of 4 million people. Now imagine being entirely alone in it. Not the comfortable kind of alone. Not the kind where you choose solitude, close the curtains, make a cup of tea and enjoy your own company. The kind where you carry something inside you that has no name in polite society. A thing that men whisper about in courts of law and never mention in drawing rooms. A thing that can send you to prison with hard labour for 2 years. A thing that destroyed the most famous writer in England just 13 years ago, and everybody watched, and nobody came to help him. That's you tonight. London, 1908. Edwardian London, at its most magnificent and most merciless. The city smells of coal smoke and horse dung and the particular sweetness of chestnuts roasting on a brazier somewhere around the corner. The streets gleam after recent rain. The gaslights are coming on one by one as the lamplighter makes his round, his long pole touching each lamp into orange life. Omnibuses clatter past, their upper decks full of bowler hats. Hansoms clip along the wet cobblestones. Newspaper boys shout headlines about something in Parliament, something about the suffragettes, something that isn't you and isn't your particular problem. Your problem is this. You know what you are. You have known for a long time, and you have no idea how to live in a world that would rather you didn't exist at all. Welcome to London in the reign of Edward VII, in the year of grace 1908. The empire is at its fullest and most self-satisfied. The dreadnoughts are being built. The wireless telegraph is connecting continents. Men are beginning to fly. Automobiles are killing people on country roads. The music halls are packing them in 6 nights a week. Women are chaining themselves to railings. The newspapers are printing photographs. Everything is changing. Everything is modern. Everything is progress. And you're a young man of 23, recently arrived from Leeds, working as a junior clerk at Marchmont and Sons, shipping agents of Fenchurch Street, earning 32 shillings a week, and you are completely, absolutely, utterly alone with the thing that you are. So I make these history stories, and honestly most of you are either asleep already, or you've found the one channel on earth that explains Victorian and Edwardian history at 11 at night, while you're under a duvet trying not to think about your own complicated life. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Get comfortable. This one goes somewhere important. Here we go. Your name is Edmund Ashford. Eddie, to the 2 people in this city who have called you anything other than your surname. You have brown hair that goes slightly wavy when it's damp, which it often is in London because London is often damp. You have your mother's eyes, which she described as hazel, and your father described as mud-coloured. Both of them right. You're neither tall nor short, neither handsome nor plain, neither remarkable nor invisible. You are, in most of the ways that matter to the people around you, entirely ordinary, which is exactly what you need to be. You've been in London for 4 months now. You have a room in a boarding house on Lamb's Conduit Street, in Bloomsbury, run by a Mrs. Partridge who does not permit female visitors above the ground floor, does not permit cooking in rooms, does not permit late returns after 11 o'clock without prior arrangement, and who has never once looked at you with anything other than neutral, commercial regard, which you appreciate more than she could possibly know. Your room is on the 2nd floor. It has a window that looks out onto a brick wall, a fireplace that works when the chimney isn't being difficult, a bed with a mattress that dips slightly in the middle, a washstand, a chest of drawers, a single wooden chair, and a small bookshelf on which you have arranged, in the 4 months since you arrived, the following items: 3 volumes of Hardy, a copy of Havelock Ellis's Sexual Inversion, which you keep spine in so the title doesn't show, a railway timetable you never use, and a small framed photograph of your mother and sister taken in a garden in Leeds 3 years ago. You look at the photograph sometimes, last thing before you blow out the candle. You don't look at the Ellis for very long at a time, not because it frightens you. Well, yes, actually, because it frightens you, but also because it is the only book in existence that has told you, in careful medical language, with German case studies and classical references and footnotes, that what you are is not unique, that there are others, that this particular configuration of the human heart has existed in every society since records began. You knew that, somewhere. You just needed to see it written down by someone who wasn't going to arrest you for it. You wake up on a Thursday morning in November. The room is cold. London is always cold in November. A damp, penetrating cold that gets through wool and brick alike and settles in your joints like a creditor who knows you're home. The fire is ash. You didn't bank it properly last night. You lie still for a moment, looking at the ceiling in the grey-through curtains light that passes for morning in this neighbourhood at this time of year. The ceiling has a water stain in one corner that looks, if you've had enough sleep, like a map of somewhere. Today it just looks like a water stain. Somewhere below you, Mrs. Partridge is making breakfast. You can smell it. Bacon fat and toast. The particular dark scent of tea brewed to the consistency of old boots, which is how English women of a certain age believe tea ought to be made. You have 45 minutes. You get up. The floorboards are cold through your socks. You cross to the washstand and pour water from the ceramic jug into the bowl. The water is cold, properly cold, not just cool, because the jug has been sitting in this unheated room all night. You wash your face. The cold water contracts every muscle in your face simultaneously, a brief violence that pulls you fully awake. You wash your neck, your ears, your hands. You dry off with the thin towel hung over the rail, the towel rough and slightly musty because there's no way to dry things properly in a room this damp. You dress. White shirt, collar carefully attached, tie, waistcoat, jacket. Dark trousers, slightly shiny at the knee from too much pressing. Black boots, their toe caps polished last Sunday, still holding their shine well enough for a Thursday. You check yourself in the small mirror above the washstand. The mirror is spotted at one edge, clouded with age. But the reflection is clear enough to see Edmund Ashford, junior clerk, 23 years old, perfectly unremarkable. Good. That's good. That's the whole point. Breakfast is taken at the long table in the dining room with the other boarders. There are 7 of them, including you. Mr. Hobbs, the piano tuner, who eats in total silence and leaves before anyone else. The Hennessy brothers, commercial travellers who are never both in residence at the same time. Miss Forrest, a typewriter girl at a legal chambers in Gray's Inn who never looks up from her book. Mr. Crane, retired, origin unknown, who speaks exclusively about the weather. And Mr. Arkwright, your nearest thing to a friend in this household, who is 34, works at a printer's in Holborn, and has the easy, unguarded warmth of a man with nothing to hide. You envy that sometimes. Mrs. Partridge serves the bacon, which is slightly overdone in the way that institutional bacon always is, as if the overcooking is part of the moral framework of respectable lodging houses. You eat it. You eat the toast. You drink the tea, which is indeed nearly black. Cold again, Mr. Crane says. Yes, you say. November, he says, as if this explains everything. Yes, you say. And that is the full extent of your conversation this morning. You're not being unfriendly. You're being careful. which in your life amounts to the same thing. Fenchurch Street is 20 minutes on foot from Lamb's Conduit Street, if you walk briskly, which you do, because the alternative is to take the Underground, and the Underground at the morning rush is a particular species of purgatory. Carriages packed so tightly that you can feel the breath of the man behind you on your neck, which is either an inconvenience or something else entirely depending on the man, and you have learned not to let yourself think about it either way. So you walk down Lamb's Conduit Street, turn south through Holborn into the city, through the ancient lanes where the buildings lean toward each other overhead, through the smell of coffee and newsprint and the morning river damp that comes off the Thames and hangs over the lower streets like a thought you can't quite clear. The city in November, early morning, 40,000 clerks descending on a square mile, black coats and bowler hats like a migratory species, all moving in the same direction, all carrying the same slightly hunted expression that the morning produces in men who must account for their time to the minute. You are one of them. You are nothing but one of them. Marchmont and Sons occupies 3 floors of a building on Fenchurch Street. The ground floor belongs to the senior partners and the correspondence clerks. The first floor is accounts. The second floor, where you work, is freight documentation, bills of lading, cargo manifests, port clearances, the interminable paperwork of a trading empire. You arrive at 8:45, the minimum acceptable time, not early enough to seem anxious, not late enough to be noticed. Your desk is by the window. It is a good desk. You earned it by being reliable and quiet and producing clean work with few errors, which is all that Marchmont and Sons has ever asked of you. You hang your coat and hat. You take your seat. You pull the first file from the stack, a cargo manifest for a vessel carrying cotton goods from Bombay. 67 line items. Each one needs to be cross-referenced against the port clearance and then entered in the ledger. You pick up your pen. You begin to write. The morning passes. There are things you notice because you have trained yourself to notice everything. Your colleague Mr. Simmons, who sits 2 desks away, has a photograph on his desk. His wife and 3 children taken in a garden somewhere. He looks at it sometimes when he thinks nobody's watching, with an expression of uncomplicated contentment that makes you feel something you don't have a good name for. Not envy, exactly. More like looking at a map of a country you're not allowed to visit. Your colleague, Mr. Davies, who is 25 and recently engaged, talks about his fiancée constantly. Miss Davies-to-be, a schoolteacher from Islington, is apparently funny and clever and very good at tennis. Mr. Davies's face, when he says her name, does a thing that other faces do. A softening and a brightening simultaneously, that you have studied with the attention of someone studying a foreign language they hope eventually to speak. You cannot speak that language. What you can do, what you've taught yourself to do over the years, starting roughly at the age of 15 when the thing inside you became impossible to ignore, is perform a close approximation of it. You can ask interested questions about Mr. Davies's fiancée. You can say the right things about Mr. Simmons's children. You can discuss the merits of various music hall performers with the general air of a young man whose interests are entirely normal. You have been doing this for 8 years. It has become in its way a kind of artistry, but artistry is exhausting. Lunch is at a chop house 3 streets over, where the clerks from half a dozen surrounding firms take their midday meal. 9pence for soup, bread, a piece of boiled beef, and tea. You eat it quickly, because the alternative is conversation, and conversation requires performance. And you are, today, very tired of performing. You're tired in a specific way that has nothing to do with the cotton manifests or the port clearances. You're tired the way you have been tired every day for the past 4 months, since you arrived in this city with your single trunk and your letter of introduction to Marchmont and Sons, and your completely unrealistic idea that London would somehow be different. You had heard things, you had read things. In Leeds, in the careful private way that you assemble such knowledge, a paragraph here, a reference there, an oblique mention in a newspaper that you had to already understand to decode, you had gathered that London contained multitudes, that somewhere in its 4 million people there were others like you, that there were places, that there was, against all probability, something resembling a life. You just haven't found it yet. The afternoon passes, the evening comes, you close your ledger at 6 o'clock, pull on your coat, descend the stairs with the departing flood of black-coated men, and emerge into the cold dark of the Fenchurch Street evening. The lamplights are already on. The streets are still busy with the last of the office workers heading for the underground, the omnibus stops, the surrounding railway stations. A newspaper seller on the corner shouts something about Parliament. A flower girl has her last few bunches of chrysanthemums, calling out prices in a voice hoarsened by a full day of use. You walk north and west toward Bloomsbury. This is when you think. Walking in the evening, when the day's performance has been put back in its box and you're briefly, in the anonymity of a crowded pavement, something closer to yourself. You think about Ellis's book, about the case studies, anonymised, clinical, but unmistakably human. A schoolteacher from the north of England, a barrister in London, a clergyman in a country parish, a naval officer, all of them living the same double life, all of them carrying the same weight. Some of them had found each other. Ellis was careful about this, careful not to provide a guide, careful to frame it all in the language of science and medical study. But between the lines, if you already knew what you were looking for, there was a suggestion. There were spaces. There were ways in which men of a particular kind had always found each other, even in a world that would rather they didn't exist. You just haven't found those spaces yet. You have been in London for 4 months. How much longer do you wait? It starts, as these things often do, with a Turkish bath. Not immediately, not that Thursday or that week. The Turkish bath is 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon in late November, when the boarding house is empty because Mrs. Partridge has gone to visit her sister in Croydon, and the remaining boarders have scattered to their weekend occupations, and you are alone in your room with the Ellis and the damp ceiling and the cold that makes the room feel smaller than it is. You need to get out. You have walked most of London's parks and neighbourhoods over your 4 months here, not looking for anything specific, or telling yourself you weren't, while looking for everything. You have walked Hyde Park in the early mornings, when the mist lies low over the Serpentine and only the dog walkers and the delivery horses are out. You have walked the streets of Soho on Saturday evenings, past the Italian restaurants and the music publishers and the boarding houses where theatrical people live, studying each face you pass with an attention you try to make look casual. You have walked Regent's Park at dusk and sat on benches watching the paths, waiting for something you couldn't name and not finding it, because you didn't know the language, didn't know the signals, didn't know where to look. The Turkish bath is on Northumberland Avenue. This is not, in itself, unusual. London has dozens of Turkish baths in 1908. They're a perfectly respectable form of hygiene and relaxation, popular with all classes, frequented by men who have spent their week behind desks and want to sweat out the accumulated coal smoke and tension. You go because it is cold and you want to be warm, and because of the nominal price of 1.06 you can have several hours of heat and stillness and not have to perform at all. The entrance is unassuming. A door, a small foyer with a bored attendant, a narrow wooden counter where you pay your money and receive a towel and a pair of cotton drawers, and a locker key on a rubber band. The attendant barely glances at you. You follow the signs down a flight of stairs and into the changing room. Wooden benches, lockers, 3 or 4 other men in various stages of undressing, none of them paying any particular attention to anyone else. You undress. You fold your clothes into the locker, turn the key, slip the rubber band over your wrist. You wrap the towel around your waist. The door at the far end of the changing room opens into warmth. Real warmth. A warmth that reaches into you and begins immediately to dissolve the specific tension of November and clerkship and 4 months of loneliness. You follow the corridor deeper in, past the warm room, into the hot room, and finally into the steam room, where the air is so thick with moisture that the opposite wall is barely visible. There are benches along the walls. You find a space and sit. The heat is extraordinary. Within 2 minutes your whole body is soaked. The muscles in your shoulders, which you hadn't known were knotted until they begin to release, loosen in stages, like knots being worked free from the inside. You close your eyes. You breathe. For the first time in 4 months you're not performing. You don't notice the man at first. He's been there when you arrived. You registered him in the vague way you register the general presence of others in a space, as furniture, as wallpaper, as the ambient backdrop of human occupation. He's seated at the far end of the bench, half visible in the steam, but after a few minutes you become aware that he is looking at you. Not staring, not obviously, just a particular quality of attention in the direction of your general existence. You open your eyes. He is perhaps 30. Dark hair plastered flat by the steam. He has a lean, clever face. The kind of face that you imagine belongs to someone who reads a great deal and talks to a great deal fewer people than they'd like to. He is, and you note this with the careful peripheral attention of someone who has trained themselves not to look directly at things they want to see, well made, lean but broad-shouldered. His towel is draped over his lap rather than wrapped around his waist. He meets your eyes. He holds them for a fraction of a second longer than is quite normal, and then he looks away. Your heart does something inconvenient. This is the language. You don't know it yet. You don't know the full vocabulary, the grammar, the entire coded communication system that men like you have built out of small gestures and carefully calibrated eye contact and the precise duration of a glance. But you are learning it right now, on this bench, in this steam, the way you learn any language, by immersion and desperation and the slowly dawning realization that yes, you have been understood. He looks back. You look back. He looks down at his hands, looks up. A very small adjustment of his position on the bench. You are aware that you are holding yourself very still, in the way you hold yourself still when something fragile is in progress. He stands, moves toward the door at the back of the steam room. The door you assumed led to another corridor, maybe the plunge pool, maybe an exit. In the doorway, he pauses. He doesn't look at you. He doesn't need to. You stand up. Your legs are slightly unsteady from the heat. You follow him through the door. The corridor beyond is narrow and dimly lit. Tiled floor. The sound of water running somewhere. He's standing a few feet ahead of you, his back to the door, and when he hears it close behind you, he turns around. "First time," he says, "at the baths?" "At this particular bath. He says it without expression, but there's a slight emphasis on particular that tells you he means something more than the building. Yes, you say. He nods, as if you've confirmed something he expected. I'm Charles. Edmund. Are you from the city? I haven't seen you before. Bloomsbury. I'm a clerk. At a shipping firm. Marchmont's, on Fenchurch Street. He says it lightly, but the specific detail makes something in you go briefly cold. Then he sees your face. I'm sorry. I recognise the Marchmont notepaper. I'm in insurance. Lloyd's. I see enough bills of lading to know the handwriting styles. The cold recedes. What do you do at Lloyd's? You ask. Mostly to be doing something other than standing here in a corridor in a towel trying not to visibly fall apart. Underwriting, marine insurance. He leans against the tiled wall with a casualness that you recognise as practised. He has done this before. He knows this corridor. You're new to London. 4 months. Leeds? He sees your expression. The vowels. Don't worry, they fade. Do they? After a year or so, you'll sound like everyone else. He pauses. Is there someone who's told you where to go? Places, I mean. The way he says it, you understand exactly what he means by places. No, you say. I haven't found anyone who... You stop. There's no safe way to complete this sentence with a stranger in a corridor in a Turkish bath. There is no safe way to have this conversation at all. You're technically in the middle of having a conversation about nothing, and you are both doing it perfectly, and you think you might cry, and that would be extremely inconvenient. There's a pub, Charles says, on Lisle Street in Soho, the Bricklayers Arms, Thursday evenings after 8, the back room. He pushes himself off the wall. It's perfectly... Well, it's not perfectly safe. Nothing is perfectly safe, but it's safer than most things. And you'll find people there. He says people in a way that means something specific. He moves past you, back toward the main baths. Thursday evenings, he says, and then he is gone. You stand in the corridor for a long moment. Your heart is loud in your ears, louder than the running water. You've been in London for 4 months and 22 days. Someone just handed you a map. You spend the next 5 days doing something that feels both revolutionary and ridiculous. Looking forward to Thursday. You think about it in the cotton manifest. You think about it over the boiled beef at the chop house. You think about it lying in your dipping mattress at 3 a.m. with the sound of Lamb's Conduit Street quiet outside your window. You think about it on the underground to Aldgate that you take when it's raining, packed between men who smell of damp wool and tobacco, and you practice looking at your own boots and thinking nothing. The Bricklayers Arms, Lisle Street, Thursday after 8. You know where Lisle Street is. You have walked through Soho on your wandering evenings, past the restaurants and the bookshops and the narrow old buildings that lean together like they're sharing a secret. Lisle Street runs between Leicester Square and the little maze of streets around St. Martin's Lane. It is not, by Edwardian standards, a fashionable address. Good. Fashionable addresses are full of people who notice things. Let me tell you about the world you're living in for a moment, because you need to understand what Thursday evening means, what the risk of Thursday evening actually is. In 1908, what you are is not a sin in the way that the church means sin, or not only that, it is a criminal offence. Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which everyone calls the Labouchere Amendment, after the Member of Parliament Henry Labouchere who put it there. It makes gross indecency between men a criminal offence punishable by up to 2 years in prison with hard labour. 2 years with hard labour. You know what that means. You know what it did to Oscar Wilde. He went to prison in 1895. came out 2 years later a broken man, and was dead by 1900 at 46. His health destroyed. His finances destroyed. His career destroyed. His name a byword for everything proper England wished to pretend didn't exist. You were 10 years old when Wilde went to prison. You didn't understand why. You were 15 when you began to understand why, and by that point the understanding came with an additional layer of knowledge that settled on you like a stone. The reason Oscar Wilde was destroyed is the same reason you have to be very, very careful. The act is deliberately vague. Gross indecency can mean almost anything. It doesn't require the specific act that was always illegal. It covers, in principle, a look held too long in the wrong place, a letter with too much warmth in it, a conversation that a judge decides was aimed in a particular direction. In practice, and the practice matters, because it's the practice that kills you. What it means is that the Metropolitan Police maintain a corps of plainclothes officers whose job, in part, is to find evidence of gross indecency. They frequent parks at night. They use informants. They sometimes use entrapment, a young constable in plain clothes who allows himself to be approached and then arrests whoever has done the approaching. They also, less formally, take money to make cases go away. This is the other thing about the Labouchere Amendment that nobody mentions in polite company. It is, as some wits have called it, the blackmailers' charter. Because a man who knows your secret can hold it over your head indefinitely. You can't go to the police. You can't pursue them through the courts. You can only pay and pay and pay and hope that they don't take your money and report you anyway. Men have been ruined this way. Men have killed themselves rather than face the alternative. You know all of this. You've assembled it piece by piece from newspapers and court reports and careful reading between lines. You have carried it with you since you were 15, and on Thursday evening you are going to walk into a pub on Lisle Street anyway, because the alternative is the dipping mattress and the cotton manifests and another 30 years of performing ordinary, which is its own kind of death, just slower and less dramatic. Thursday comes. You eat nothing at dinner. Mrs. Partridge notices, "Not hungry, Mr. Ashford," and you say you have a slight headache, and she nods with the particular nurse-like satisfaction of a woman who has been right about the importance of wearing proper overcoats in November. You go to your room. You sit on the bed. You look at the photograph of your mother and sister. You think about what you're about to do. You think about Wilde, about the newspaper reports, the ones you read years later in the Leeds Library, piecing together what had happened, about Reading Jail, where they kept him, about the letter he wrote from prison, the one they eventually published, the one where he described, in the careful oblique way that everything was described, what it was to be utterly stripped of everything you had built. You think about the other names, the ones that didn't become famous, the ones that appeared briefly in court reports, condemned to their 2 years of hard labour and then disappeared from the record. The solicitors and school teachers and shopkeepers and clerks. The clerks especially. You think about them for a long time, and then you put on your good coat, the one you keep for Sundays and occasions, and you go out. November London at 8:30 in the evening. The fog is coming in from the river. Not the thick pursuper that you read about in the old descriptions. The Coal Smoke Abatement Society has been doing their work, and the fogs are less monstrous than they were even 20 years ago, but enough to give the gaslights a halo and blur the edges of buildings, and make the street sounds come from no particular direction. You walk west from Bloomsbury through Severn Garden, which at this hour is moving from its daytime commerce into its evening entertainments. The fruit and vegetable carts are mostly gone. The flower sellers are packing up. The restaurants and theatres and public houses are opening their doors. Men in evening dress are arriving in hansoms. Women in long coats and elaborate hats are being handed down from carriages. You turn south into the streets around Leicester Square. The square itself is lively. Electric lights now on the facades of the Empire and the Alhambra, that relatively new and slightly disreputable brightness that has been spreading through central London. The music halls are filling up. The restaurants are serving. Street sellers are pushing their last carts of the day. The noise is considerable. Voices and wheels, and the occasional burst of music from an open door. Leal Street is just south of the square, narrower, quieter, less theatrical. The kind of street that exists to service the louder streets around it. The Bricklayers Arms is midway along, identifiable by a faded sign above the door. A painter in the distant past having rendered a single arm extended with a bricklayer's trowel, the paint now dark with age and soot. The windows are frosted glass. The door is solid wood, closed. You stand across the street for a moment. There is no particular reason why this pub should look different from any other pub in this city. It looks from here exactly like what it is. A small, slightly tired public house in a side street in central London. And yet your heart is doing that inconvenient thing again. You cross the street. You put your hand on the door. You push it open. The smell hits you first, as it always does with English pubs. Beer soaked into the wood of a century. Tobacco smoke. The vinegary tang of the spill tray. The coal fire that's been going since morning. Underneath it, the warm human density of a room where people have been gathering all evening. The front bar is ordinary. A barman with impressive side whiskers, a row of taps, half a dozen men standing or sitting, all of them having the kinds of conversations that happen in pub front bars. A desultory argument about a football result. A man with a newspaper reading aloud the racing results to nobody in particular. Two men in work clothes sitting in silence with their pints. Nobody looks at you. You go to the bar. You ask for a half of bitter. You pay your penny halfpenny. You hold the glass and look around the room with the practised casualness of someone who is very carefully not looking for anything. At the back of the room, a door. It is indistinguishable from dozens of such doors in dozens of such establishments. Painted the same grim dark brown as the wainscoting, a little worn at the handle, no sign on it. A man comes out of that door. He is perhaps 40, wearing a good suit, nothing remarkable about him at all, and he goes to the bar and says something to the barman, who nods and pulls him a pint, and then he goes back through the door. You drink about a third of your bitter. You put the glass on the bar. You go through the door. The back room is about half the size of the front bar. It is lit by 2 gas brackets on the wall, slightly lower than the general ambience of the front, giving the room a quality of deliberate intimacy. There is a second fireplace, a small one with a decent fire going, half a dozen small tables, benches along 2 walls, and in this room there are perhaps 14 people. They are not performing anything. That is the first thing you notice, and it takes you a moment to understand why it strikes you so forcefully. It is simply that nobody in this room is performing. Nobody is doing the thing you've been doing for 8 years. The careful maintenance of an appearance designed to satisfy observers who must not suspect. The particular held quality of a man monitoring himself constantly from the outside. These people are just being. A man in a corner is laughing. Not the careful, calibrated laugh of a man being socially appropriate. A real laugh at something the man across from him has said, and the laugh involves his whole face and his shoulders, and the way he sets down his glass. Two men at one of the tables are in what is clearly an argument, but the low-voiced, intimate kind of argument that belongs to people who know each other very well. An older man near the fire is reading a newspaper with complete calm. A young man who might be your age is sitting slightly apart, looking at his drink, and he has the look you recognise from the mirror. The new arrival, the recently found, still trying to work out if this is real. You find a place on the bench along the wall. A woman appears from somewhere, not a customer. She moves with the efficiency of someone who works here, and asks what you're having. You ask for another bitter. She brings it without ceremony. You look at the room. The room looks back in the casual peripheral way of people who are each privately doing their own version of the same assessment. You're not sure what you expected. Something more dramatic, perhaps. Something that looked more like the dangerous underground it technically is. What you find is just people sitting in a warm room, in reasonable safety, being themselves. It is, you will realise later, the most extraordinary thing you've ever seen. The man who comes to sit beside you is not Charles from the Turkish bath. He is someone new entirely, short, red-faced, in his mid-30s, with the calloused hands of someone who works with them, and the slightly incongruous, well-tailored jacket of someone who has recently come into money, or is very careful about one aspect of their appearance. "First time?" he says. "Is it that obvious?" "You've got the look." He says it without unkindness, with the particular warmth of someone who remembers having the look themselves. "Tommy? Edmund? Where are you from, Edmund? Not London?" "Leeds." "Ha! I'm from Sheffield. Came down 12 years ago." He takes a drink. "You're a clerk?" "Shipping firm. You?" "Carpenter. I work on the new buildings, the ones going up everywhere, all the roads they're widening." He says this with a matter-of-fact simplicity that somehow, in this room, fits. You had a half-formed idea that the men in a place like this would be, what? Aesthetes, perhaps. Men of letters and artistic tendencies. The kind of men who could deploy the language of Greek love and Roman friendship, and all the classical vocabulary that allowed educated men to speak without saying anything incriminating. And some of them are doubtless precisely that. But Tommy the carpenter is not. "How did you find this place?" you ask. "A man told me. Same way you found it, I'd wager." "A man in a Turkish bath," he laughs. "Exactly. It's always a Turkish bath or a particular park bench or someone sitting next to you at the music hall. Word of mouth. Very careful. Very slow. But once you're in..." He gestures at the room. "Once you're in, you're in." Is it safe here? The question comes out of you before you can consider whether to ask it, and you hear it hanging in the air and feel slightly embarrassed by how much is packed into the word safe. Tommy's expression becomes not less warm, but more considered. "Safe enough," he says. "The landlord knows what goes on back here. He's one of us, if you want to know the truth, though he'd never say so. The barman in the front doesn't ask questions. The locals know this is that kind of place, and they leave us alone because they'd rather have us in the back room than in their front bars. And the police. There's a sergeant at the Bow Street station who gets an envelope once a month. I don't know the exact arrangement, but it holds." "For how long?" 12 years that I've been coming here," Tommy says, "though there was a spot of trouble about 4 years back when a new superintendent came in. We went dark for about 3 months, stopped meeting here, used a private address instead. Then things settled, and we came back. Went dark, like a ship running without lights. What happened during the trouble? Nothing in the end. One man was questioned. Not here, somewhere else, nothing to do with this place, and he kept his head. Gave them nothing. They let it go. He drinks again. You learn to be careful. Where you walk, who you talk to, what you put in writing. Never put it in writing. That's the first rule. You think about the Ellis spine in on your bookshelf. Second rule, Tommy says, is you don't talk about real names outside. In here, we're all first names. If you meet a man here and you go somewhere together, which isn't something I'm suggesting, just telling you how it is, you don't know his last name and he doesn't know yours. If the worst happens, you can only damage yourself. The worst being arrested and asked to name your associates. Yes, he says it calmly. It happened to a man I knew 7 years ago. He was arrested in the park, not careful enough. They asked him for names. He gave them one. That man lost his position, lost everything. And the man who gave the name had already given everything else, so it didn't even help him in court. You are quiet for a moment. It sounds like living in a state of permanent emergency, you say. Does it? Tommy looks at the room with the fond, considering eye of a man looking at something he loves. I've thought about it differently mostly. I've thought, I have this. I have these people, this room, these evenings. I have a life that is not everything, but something real, something mine. He turns back to you. You're very new. Things look different when you've been here longer. The danger's real, I won't lie about that. But so is this. He indicates the room again. So is this. I should tell you something about the world you have just stepped into, because it is older and stranger and more elaborately constructed than you yet know. The Molly Houses. That's what they were called 200 years ago. Going back to the early 18th century, in the Seven Dials and Moorfields and other parts of London that no longer exist in the same form, there were houses, often the backs of taverns, often upstairs rooms in coffee shops, where men who loved men gathered. They had their own rituals, their own names for each other, their own private language. The magistrates periodically raided them. Men were arrested, pilloried, hanged. And the houses closed for a while and then opened somewhere else, because the need was stronger than the danger. This is not new. What you have found tonight is the current form of something that has been here for centuries. Before the Labouchere Amendment, there was the sodomy law, which was actually worse, the death penalty until 1861, and even after that, life imprisonment. Men survived it. Men built lives around it. Men found each other in the same careful sideways way you found Charles in the steam room and Charles directed you here. This network, this web of careful coded communication and trusted intermediaries and private rooms has been rebuilt and destroyed more times than anyone can count. It exists because the need for it is ineradicable. It exists because you cannot legislate human longing out of existence, however hard you try. That's worth knowing. You stay in the back room of the Bricklayers Arms until nearly 10 o'clock. You talk to Tommy for another 20 minutes, and then he is drawn away into a conversation with two men at the next table, and you're left briefly alone with your glass and the fire and the room. You watch. A man is introduced to another man at a corner table, and they shake hands and begin talking, and within a few minutes they are leaning toward each other with the unconscious gravity of people discovering a shared language. An older man sitting near the fire, the one who was reading the newspaper when you arrived, catches you watching and gives you a small nod. Not unfriendly, merely acknowledging you are here. You're seen, that is not nothing. The young man who looked like you when you arrived, the new one still disbelieving, has found someone to talk to. A man about 10 years older who's listening with what appears to be genuine interest, nodding occasionally, asking questions. The young man's face, when you watch it over the rim of your glass, is doing something extraordinary. It is relaxing. The particular held quality, the monitoring from the outside, is loosening. He looks for the first time since you saw him, something like comfortable. You recognise it. You're doing the same thing. It is Charles who appears at 5 minutes to 10. He comes through the door from the front bar, sees you on the bench and crosses the room with the unhurried ease of a man who lives in his skin without apology. You came, he says. You told me about it, you say. I came. He sits beside you. He has a glass of something that is not beer, whiskey, from the colour and the smell. How long have you been here? Since 8:30. And? You look at the room. The fire. The men. Tommy in his carpenter's jacket. The new young man on the brink of something. I don't know yet, you say. You search for the word. It's more than I expected, and less frightening than I expected. And I don't quite know what to do with that. Charles makes a sound that might be agreement, or might be the result of a private thought. The first time I came here, he says, I stood in the street for 20 minutes before I could make myself go in. He says this without apparent embarrassment, as a statement of fact. Then I came in and found a room full of men having perfectly ordinary conversations, and I felt extremely foolish for having been so frightened. And then the fear came back. Yes, obviously the fear came back. The fear always comes back because the danger is real. He drinks. But it comes back in a different form. Not the fear that this doesn't exist, that there's nothing here, that you're alone, a more manageable fear. The fear that requires specific precautions rather than the vague terror of having no name for what you are. You consider this. Ellis calls it inversion, you say, and then realise you've just admitted to having read Ellis, which is, Charles smiles. I know the book. Most of us have read it, or tried to. It's not entirely kind. His language is medical. We're a condition to him, not people. He says it's not degeneracy. He does. Progress of a sort. He turns his glass. Have you read Carpenter? Edward Carpenter? I've read of that blessed man and his friends. The Love Comrade pamphlet is better, if you can find it. He glances at you sidelong. He uses the word Uranian, for men like us. He prefers it to inversion, less clinical. Uranian. From the Greek, Aphrodite, Urania, heavenly Aphrodite, the patroness of a particular kind of love. You've encountered the word in other contexts and other careful reading. Oscar Wilde used it. Some of the poets used it. I know the word, you say. Come back next Thursday, Charles says, and the one after that. Get your bearings. Learn who's who to trust, who not to trust. There'll be time for Carpenter. You leave the Bricklayers Arms at 10:05. The door closes behind you, the warmth and sound of the room cut off instantly, and you're standing on Lisle Street in the November fog. You stand there for a moment, your breath making ghosts in the cold air. The street is quiet. A couple passing at the far end headed toward Leicester Square. A cat crossing the road with the sovereign indifference of London cats. The distant sound of a piano from somewhere. A music hall or a public house, or someone's parlour window left slightly open. You begin to walk north toward Bloomsbury. Your mind is very loud. Not with fear exactly, though the fear is there, a constant undertone, the awareness of what you've just done and what it means in law, and in society. But louder than the fear is something else. something you don't quite have a word for. Possibility. That's the closest you can get. You walked into a room tonight where nobody was performing, where 14 men sat in a back room of a Soho pub and talked to each other without monitoring themselves from the outside, where a carpenter from Sheffield and an insurance underwriter from Lloyd's and a young man from Leeds and all the others occupied a small space of genuine existence. It existed. It was there. You found it. The weeks that follow are a different kind of life. You go back to the Bricklayers Arms the following Thursday, and the one after that, and the one after that. You learn names, first names only, as Tommy explained. Charles, who works at Lloyd's. Tommy the carpenter. An older man named Arthur, who is, from certain oblique references, a retired civil servant of some kind, who brings a certain Edwardian dignity to everything and drinks his whiskey with the expression of a man who has outlived several governments and is in no hurry to be impressed by the current one. There is William, who is 26, works as a journalist on one of the smaller newspapers, and has the journalist's habit of noticing everything, and the journalist's absolute inability to keep his opinions to himself. There is a man who goes by Freddie, who Tommy says is the son of someone quite well known, though Tommy won't say whose son, and who arrives most Thursday evenings in a good suit that is slightly too good for the Bricklayers Arms, and sits in the corner with an air of having discovered that the world which raised him has told him a fundamental lie. And there are others who come and go. The room is never exactly the same twice. A man who appears for 3 consecutive Thursdays and then is never seen again. He moved, Tommy says not arrested, moved to Manchester to be near someone. A pair of men who come together and leave together and are clearly, from the way they look at each other, not just friends, though they are careful about it, careful even here. You learn the rhythms, who sits where, who talks to whom, what's discussed openly and what's discussed quietly in corners. The conversations range: books, politics, music, the news, arguments about whether women should have the vote, with most of the room strongly in favour, which you find interesting in a population that has its own reasons to be sceptical of the law's wisdom. Arguments about whether the new automobiles are a civilizing force or an abomination. An extended debate one cold December evening about whether the Edwardian music hall is an art form or a descent into vulgarity. There is a lot of humour. This surprises you most, you think. You had expected the room to be serious, burdened, the way you had been burdened, with the weight of what you were and the impossibility of it. But the room is not exactly light, not careless. The awareness of danger is always there. The way cold is always there in a London November, even when you're sitting next to a fire. But the room is funny, in the way that people who have decided to live their lives anyway are often funny, with an awareness of the absurdity of the situation, the sheer theatrical preposterousness of living your actual life in a back room while performing a different life in the front bar. Did you see the piece in the Times, William says one Thursday, about the campaign to stamp out degeneracy in the public parks? The Metropolitan Police Commissioner's annual report. I saw it, says someone. He estimates there are. William looks at the ceiling, performing memory. I believe the figure he used was alarmingly many, which I think is the Commissioner's precise scientific nomenclature. Alarmingly many, Arthur says gravely. Indeed, he intends to stamp us out. He says so. The full force of the law. The full force of the law, Tommy repeats, and there is something in his voice that is not quite laughter and not quite bitterness, something that exists in the space between them. And yet, says Charles, here we are. Here we are, Tommy agrees. Alarmingly, says Arthur. And then the room does laugh, and it is real laughter, and the fire crackles, and outside on Lisle Street the fog is thick and London is enormous, and 4 million people are living their lives, and in this small room 14 of them are choosing to be the thing they actually are. You will learn over the weeks that the Bricklayers Arms is only one part of what exists. There are other places, Charles tells you on Thursday, when the back room is quieter than usual, and you're both sitting by the fire with drinks and the particular ease of two people who've spent enough evenings in proximity to have developed a tentative friendship. Different kinds of places for different kinds of things. Tell me, he considers, the public parks at night. You know about those? I know it's dangerous, very dangerous. Plainclothes police, particularly in the summer. A man was arrested in Regent's Park in August. I don't know him. Friend of William's, I think. He was questioned and released, but it was close. So not the parks. Not unless you know what you're doing, and even then, he turns his glass. The Turkish baths. You know about those. There are several. The one on Northumberland Avenue where we met, obviously. There's one on Duke Street that is... He pauses, deciding how to characterise it. More open. The management is extremely relaxed about what happens in certain rooms. But it's also more frequented, which means more risk of an encounter that you'd rather not have. What kind of encounter? The kind that walks out of the door and comes back with a police constable, or the kind that doesn't go to the police but asks you for money instead? Blackmail. The word sits between you and the firelight like a cold thing. Has it happened to anyone you know? To a man I used to know. He's gone now. Not arrested, but gone. He paid for 2 years and then he ran out of money and he left London. I don't know where he is now. Charles says it without visible emotion, with the flat pragmatic acceptance of someone who has had years to accommodate a fact they don't like. He was careless, not here, nothing to do with this place, but careless in another context, and someone saw it and chose to make money from it, rather than either look away or report it. How do you stop it happening? You don't entirely. You reduce the risk. You're careful. You don't use your real name in the wrong places. You don't put things in writing, he glances at you. You don't keep books that you wouldn't want a magistrate to see. You think about the Ellis on your shelf. Noted, you say. The private parties are safer, Charles continues. People keep their own rooms, their own flats, and host. Small gatherings. 6 or 8 people, known to each other, vouched for. Doors locked. Are you invited to those? Sometimes. I'll bring you if you like, when the time is right. He says it with the casualness of an offer, not a promise. There are 2 or 3 people I know who host regularly. They're careful. The address doesn't circulate widely. How long have they been doing it? One of them has been hosting for, he thinks, 15 years, at the same address, without incident. 15 years, in the same rooms, the same careful hospitality, the same locked doors and drawn curtains. You find this both encouraging and melancholy in ways you can't cleanly separate. December brings cold and the shortening of days to almost nothing. By 4 o'clock the city is dark, and the gas lights and the new electric signs are doing their best against a darkness that feels more thorough than it should. Christmas approaches, the shops fill up. The streets of Oxford Street and Regent Street take on their commercial festive character. Salvation Army bands play at corners. Boys sell roasted chestnuts from barrows, the smell of them sweet and faintly scorched, visible clouds of steam in the cold air. You go home to Leeds for 4 days over Christmas. This is ordinary. This is what junior clerks do. They take the train home for the holiday and spend it being fed and questioned by their families. Your mother is delighted to see you. She feeds you things you forgot you missed. Proper bread, mutton stew the way she makes it, the particular smell of the kitchen where you grew up that you cannot name or describe but recognise instantly as home. Your father asks about the position at Marchmont's. You tell him it's going well. He nods with the satisfaction of a man whose son is doing the right thing. Your sister, who is 19 and sharp-eyed, says, "You seem different, happier." You're surprised by this. You didn't know it showed. "London," you say. "I'm getting used to London." "I might want to come to London," she says. "There are better positions for typewriter girls in London than here." "I'll tell you everything about it," you say, "when you're ready." You wonder briefly if she carries her own version of whatever it is you carry. The held quality, the performance, some other kind of secret that requires its own back room. You don't ask. It's not a conversation for the Christmas kitchen, but you think about it on the train back to London, watching the Yorkshire countryside turn into the Midlands, turn into the home counties, the January fields grey and flat under a low sky. January in London is grey and wet and extremely cold, and somehow perfect for thinking. You think about the room on Lisle Street, about Charles and Tommy and Arthur and William and the others, about what you now know exists and what you still don't know, about the private parties that Charles mentioned. In February, he asks you. "There's a gathering," Charles says one Thursday evening in early February. "A friend of mine. He lives in Chelsea, has rooms on Cheyne Walk. He hosts a few times a year." "What kind of gathering?" "Dinner, 8 or 10 people, then conversation, music if someone's inclined. He has a piano, a few drinks." He pauses. "And private." "How private?" "The kind where you use your first name and nothing else, and if anyone asks, you were all at dinner at the Reform Club, which the host is a member of, so it's not even entirely a lie." You consider this. "Yes," you say, "I'd like to come." The house on Cheyne Walk is tall and narrow and overlooks the Thames. It was built in the 17th century, or most of it was, and has that quality of old London houses that have been modified so many times that each layer of addition is slightly visible through the current one, like strata in rock. The exterior is unassuming. Dark brick, white-painted windows, a brass knocker. The street itself is quiet and slightly refined. Chelsea has that quality in 1908. It is fashionable without being ostentatious, artistic without being bohemian, expensive without looking it. You arrive with Charles at 7:30. He uses the knocker twice. The door is opened by the host himself, not a servant, which tells you something about the gathering before you've said a word. The host is a man called Julian. That is all you know. Julian. He is perhaps 45, grey-haired, with the manner of a man who is accustomed to making people feel at home, and who does it without apparent effort. He's wearing a beautifully cut suit and a cravat of deep green silk, and he shakes your hand with warm certainty. "Charles's friend from Leeds," he says. "Welcome, come in." The hallway is warm and smells of beeswax polish and something cooking somewhere in the back of the house, something with wine in it. The walls are hung with pictures. Some of them, you notice as you're relieved of your coat, are nudes, painted in a classical style that places them somewhere in a tradition stretching back to ancient Greece, but which are unmistakably men, and unmistakably not pretending to be anything else. You stand for a moment looking at one of them. Julian, seeing your expression, says, "A friend painted them. He studied in Florence." A pause. "They do look rather well in this light. They look rather well in this light." In any other house in London, these pictures would constitute evidence. In this house, they hang on the wall, and they look rather well. The other guests arrive over the next half hour. You meet them in the drawing room over glasses of sherry, carefully by first name, in the manner you have learned from the Bricklayers Arms. Gregory is 28, has the lean, intense face of someone who reads Latin for pleasure and turns out to work for the British Museum. He knows Charles slightly. They've been to the same baths, in the circuitous language of this world. Edward is 40, a solicitor, who shakes your hand with professional firmness and then spends the first 15 minutes talking about a case he's currently working on involving a disputed shipping cargo, which leads to a 20-minute conversation about Marchmonts and the nature of freight documentation, which is both the most normal conversation you've had in months and, in this context, unexpectedly delightful. Henry is 19, a student at the Slade, who speaks very quickly about painting and Cézanne and post-impressionism and the exhibition that Roger Fry is apparently trying to organise, and who has the air of someone who's only recently discovered that the world contains other people like him and is still slightly overwhelmed by the discovery. Richard is 53. He says he's retired. He has the look of someone who was in the army, and the stillness of someone who has spent a long time being very careful. He drinks his sherry with precision and listens more than he speaks, and when he does speak, what he says is always exact. And there is Marcus, who is 32, who writes. Novels and other things, he says, slightly vaguely, and who looks at the room with the novelist's assessing eye, and who, you will discover over the course of the evening, is the funniest person you have ever met. Dinner is extraordinary. Not the food, though the food is good. A soup, a lamb, something with wine in it, cheese and fruit, good wine throughout. Ordinary dinner party food, in a way that bespeaks money without ostentation. What is extraordinary is the conversation. You've been sitting in drawing rooms and dining rooms and boarding house breakfast tables for 23 years, and in all of them the conversation has been performed, in the sense that all social conversation is performative, shaped by convention and propriety, and the need to be seen saying the right thing. Even the best conversations you have contained this. The monitoring, the self-editing, the awareness of what you can and cannot say. At this table, that apparatus is absent. Not entirely. These men are careful, all of them. It is in the texture of how they speak. The habit of discretion so deeply embedded it no longer looks like discretion, just manner. But within that framework, within the assumption of safety that the locked door and the drawn curtains and the trusted company provide, the conversation goes places you have never heard conversation go. Marcus talks about a novel he's writing, not in the oblique way that a novelist might usually describe a work in progress, aware of the room, aware of what's sayable, but directly about two men and what exists between them, about how you write that truthfully, in a form that can be published without destroying the person who wrote it. Forster does it with subtext, he says. Beautifully, but it's subtext. It has to be subtext because Forster would like to continue existing. Wilde did it directly, Gregory says. Wilde is dead. He put it in the essays and the plays more than the novels, in the criticism. The problem, Marcus says, is that the form most suited to what we actually want to say requires a frankness that the law makes impossible. It's not just that you'd be arrested, it's that the book would be suppressed. Everything. Imagine writing honestly about what it is to be us and having every copy burned. They burned Whitman in certain quarters, Richard says, and he was American, which gives him a certain remove. Whitman, Marcus says. Well, yes. Carpenter uses him, you say, as a precedent. This is the first substantial thing you've said at this table, and several faces turn toward you. Carpenter is interesting, Charles says. He's less cautious than Whitman, but he has the benefit of being less famous. Fewer people read him, which means fewer people think to be outraged. He's at Millthorpe, you say, in Derbyshire. I've been near there. People know who he is, what he believes. What he lives, Julian says from the head of the table. He says it without drama. He lives what he believes. That's rare, in any field. It's also a choice most of us can't afford, Richard says. He has money. He has connections. He has the fact of being a public intellectual, which means that arresting him would be more embarrassing than not arresting him. The class question, Marcus says. Inevitably. This is the other conversation that runs underneath everything in the back room of the Bricklayers Arms and at Julian's table in Chelsea. The class question. The fact that the Labouchere Amendment does not, in practice, fall equally on all classes. That Oscar Wilde was convicted in part because he had the temerity to be publicly, brilliantly himself at a time when the establishment decided it would make an example. That Lord Alfred Douglas, born an aristocrat, was never charged. That money and name and connections have always provided a certain insulation against the law's full enthusiasm. Tommy the carpenter is more at risk than Julian in his Chelsea house. You, a junior clerk in a boarding house in Bloomsbury, are more at risk than Charles, who has position at Lloyd's and presumably friends in certain places. The men who are arrested in the parks are not from this table, Richard says. No, says Marcus, they are not. They are men without options, Richard says. Men who cannot afford the privacy that the rest of us maintain. Men who must use public spaces because they have no private spaces, and who encounter plainclothes policemen who are very specifically deployed in those public spaces. And yet the law applies to all of us equally, Julian says. He says it with a slight irony that contains several volumes. As the law does, Richard says, with an irony that contains several more. After dinner, the party moves to the drawing room, where Julian's piano does indeed get played, by Henry the student, who turns out to be rather good, playing Schubert first, and then, at the room's request, something more modern, something French, Fauré. The notes precise and searching in the warm room. You sit with a glass of brandy and listen to the piano and think that this is the most vivid thing that has happened to you since you arrived in London. Not the most dramatic, not the most dangerous, but the most vivid, in the sense of most fully real, most fully experienced without the interference of the monitoring apparatus that normally stands between you and your own perception. Charles sits beside you. Well, he says quietly. I'm trying to find the word for it, you say. He's quiet. Outside, the Thames is just audible. A boat, a horn in the distance, the particular watery silence of a large river at night. Relief, you say, eventually. Yes, he says. That's usually the word. Winter giving way to spring, the city brightening incrementally, the days lengthening by minutes. Thursday evenings at the Bricklayers Arms, occasional evenings at Julian's, twice more before the spring is done. The developing familiarity of first names and known faces, and the small accumulated knowledge of people who meet regularly in a private context. You learn things, not just about them, their histories, their work, their private textures, the particular individual shapes that lives lived in this way take on, but about the world you're now moving through. You learn about the blackmailers. This is spoken of in the room with the flat directness that attends anything dangerous that everyone knows about, but that most conversations outside this room pretend doesn't happen. There are men, Tommy calls them those men, which is the closest the room comes to a slur, though it's aimed at criminals rather than any category of person, who frequent the parks and the baths for the sole purpose of identifying targets and threatening them. Some of them were formerly police officers. Some of them work in concert with police officers in an arrangement whose precise mechanics nobody in the room claims to understand fully, but which produces the result that men are sometimes given the choice between money and arrest. The standard approach, William says one Thursday in his journalist's matter-of-fact way, is to establish contact, establish what you are, ideally in writing, which is why you never write anything, then demand money. If money is forthcoming, they sometimes go away. If money isn't forthcoming, they sometimes report you. If money is forthcoming and they've been paid enough times, they sometimes report you anyway. What's the right response? Henry asks. He is 19 and asking carefully. Don't give them anything to use, William says. No writing, no assignations in public places, no indiscretion. And if they approach you, refuse. Don't bargain, don't explain, refuse and walk away and tell someone you trust. And if they do report you? William is quiet for a moment. A good solicitor, Charles says. No one. Have his name ready. Edward, someone says, nodding toward the solicitor who has been listening to this conversation with the expression of a man who's had it before. I will not name names at a table, Edward says. But there are barristers who handle these cases with discretion, and some of them achieve reasonable outcomes, particularly if the police evidence is thin. The law is impossible, but the law's application depends on evidence, and evidence can be challenged. He pauses. I am not advising anyone to commit a criminal offence. I am simply noting that the range of outcomes includes some that are less catastrophic than others. There is silence in which everyone at the table contemplates the range of outcomes. Wilde, Henry says quietly. Wilde made tactical decisions that a good counsel would have advised against, Edward says. He brought the initial libel action, which opened the door to everything that followed. Had he not done that, had he simply tolerated Queensberry's card and walked away, it is possible the whole thing might have faded. He was in love, Arthur says. He has been silent through this conversation, as he often is, occupying his chair by the fire with the particular stillness of a man who has heard all of this before. He was in love, and he was brave, and he was perhaps not well advised. And the law destroyed him. A pause. We carry him with us, whether we like it or not. We carry him with us. The room is quiet for a moment. Yes, Charles says. Spring arrives with an almost aggressive brightness. The London spring that always seems like a surprise to the city's residents, as if they'd somehow expected winter to be permanent. The parks fill up with people sitting in the new warmth. Street sellers appear with earlier produce. The days stretch. Work feels less oppressive. You've been in London for 7 months. You're becoming fluent in the language of your hidden life. There are things you have learned about the city that you wouldn't have known otherwise. You know, for instance, that the Turkish baths are not all equal in their tolerance, and that the difference between a bath where the management has made a private accommodation and one where they haven't is not immediately visible from the outside and must be learned through the network. You know that Hyde Park at a certain hour on certain evenings is a different place from Hyde Park in the afternoon, and that the men who walk certain paths at that hour are engaged in an activity that is extremely dangerous, and that some of them are policemen and some of them are looking for connections and some of them are both. You know that there are clubs, not the Bricklayers Arms kind, but the other kind, the private members' clubs of Pall Mall and St James's, where certain men go and are known to each other, and where the discretion of the establishment is absolute and has been for decades. You will never be admitted to these clubs. They require money and position and birth that you don't have. But they exist, and their existence is part of the layered city that you are learning. You know about Polari. This is the thing that William tells you about. One Thursday evening in April, in the way that William tells you about things, completely with examples and etymology and his journalist's love of the telling detail. It's a language, he says. A kind of secret language, though that makes it sound more dramatic than it is. It's more like a pidgin, a mix of things. Italian words, Cockney rhyming slang, theatrical slang, the language of market traders and sailors and carnival workers and men like us, all mixed together. What does it sound like? Polari, that's the word for it, comes from the Italian parlare to speak. Let me think. He looks at the ceiling. Your aunt is a friend. Your husband. Vada the omnipolone, or see the gay man. Bona, that means good. Bona vada, good looking. He grins. Fantabulosa, that one's obvious. Who speaks it? Men like us, mainly the ones who've been around longer, who work in the theatre or come from working class backgrounds where the theatrical and fairground world and the underworld all mix. It's older than you think. It goes back at least 100 years in various forms. Sailors used it, market porters used it. He drinks. It's useful because you can say what you mean in front of people who don't know it and they won't understand. And the people who do know it will understand, so you know who they are. Is it used here? By some people. Charles doesn't use it much. He thinks it's beneath him, though he'd never say so. Tommy uses it when he's comfortable. Arthur is perfectly fluent but won't admit it. He lowers his voice to mockery. Too theatrical. You look at Tommy across the room. Tommy, you say, carefully trying out. Bona to varda your dolly old eek. Tommy turns around. His eyebrows go up. Then he grins. A real grin, wide and slightly surprised. Who taught you that? William. God help us. But he's still grinning. Bona to varda your dolly old eek. Good to see your pretty old face. It is in May that the trouble comes. Not to you, not directly. But close enough. The Thursday evening in question starts like any other. You arrive at the Bricklayers Arms at 8:15. Get your bitter from the barman with the side whiskers. Go through the door into the back room. The room is slightly emptier than usual. Arthur is there, by the fire. Tommy is there, talking in a low voice to a man you don't know. Charles is there, sitting by himself with his whiskey, and his expression when you sit beside him is not quite right. What happened, you ask? A man I know, not someone who comes here, someone from the baths. He was approached in the park last week. You go still. Approached how? A plainclothes man made an offer explicit enough. Your man declined, correctly, and walked away, directly to a solicitor. Correct response. He drinks, but he's been questioned anyway. The officer filed a report claiming a different sequence of events. He was set up. He was set up. Charles says it with the flat certainty of a man who is not surprised, which is its own kind of horror. The officer claims your man made an approach. Your man says the reverse. It's his word against an officer of the Metropolitan Police. What will happen to him? Edward is working on it. There are inconsistencies in the officer's report. It may be possible to... He stops. I don't know. Edward thinks there's a chance. But your man has had to tell his employer that he may be absent for certain days for legal matters, and his employer has already made certain inquiries that suggest his position may not survive. You think about your own position. Marchmont and Sons, Mr. Simmons and his photograph, Mr. Davies and his fiancée. He'll lose his job, even if the case goes away. Yes. Charles turns his glass. This is why the parks are not... Why I tell people not to use the parks. This is why. Something hardens briefly in his voice and then smooths back. He knew the risk. He was careless. Were you careless once? He looks at you. I was careful, he says. I have been careful since before I knew what careful meant. Since before I had words for any of this. A pause. I've been careful in the particular way that requires a great deal of energy and produces a particular kind of exhaustion. But you've never... No, never arrested, never questioned, never directly threatened. He finishes his whiskey. I've been lucky. I've been careful. Those things are not the same, but they help each other. The man's name, his first name, the only name you have, is Peter. You have never met Peter. He's a figure in a story told across a table in a pub in Soho. He exists for you as a presence and a warning. 2 weeks after the Thursday evening conversation, William tells you the update. Peter's case has been dropped. The officer's report contained a specific inconsistency, a timing detail that Edward's people established could not have been correct, and a quiet conversation was had at a level that William doesn't specify between someone, and the report was withdrawn. Peter has his freedom. He has lost his position. He's looking for another one. He'll find something, William says. He's competent. These things are manageable in the end. Are they? They have to be. The alternative is... Well, we're all here, aren't we? We've all decided the alternative is worse. Summer in London. The city in summer is something specific, a kind of concentrated urban living that the rest of the year only approximates. The parks are full from early morning. The Thames smells. The streets are loud and bright, and the nights are short enough that the transition between evening and morning has barely time to happen. You have been here for 10 months. You know the city now, with the particular knowledge of someone who has learned it on foot and in detail. Not just its main arteries, but its side streets, its cut-throughs, the places where the character changes abruptly from one building to the next, the parts that the guidebooks mention, and the parts that don't appear in guidebooks. You know the city's other geography too. The Turkish bath on Duke Street, where Charles was right about the management's relaxed attitude, and also about the increased risk that comes with it. The private apartments whose first names and general addresses circulate in the network. The particular benches in certain parks that you know to avoid. The theatre district in the evenings, where the company of actors and musicians provides a useful general air of tolerant bohemianism. You have been to 2 more evenings at Julian's house in Chelsea. You've been to an afternoon gathering at Gregory's rooms in Bloomsbury, his college rooms technically, since he has a fellowship at a college attached to the University of London, where 6 people drank tea and talked about classical literature with a freedom that the classics actually permit, given that Plato discussed these things with perfect frankness in 400 BC, which is one of the useful precedents. You have not been arrested. You have not been questioned. You have not been approached by anyone who wanted money. What happens in July is neither luck nor carelessness exactly. It is the thing that exists between them, the encounter that you don't seek and can't avoid. It is a Saturday afternoon in July. You are walking back from Soho after a lunch with Marcus, who has just finished the first draft of his novel and wanted company to celebrate and someone to tell him whether certain passages struck you as plausible, which they do, with a specificity that makes the question of his research less interesting than the question of his experience, though you don't ask. You are walking east through Covent Garden, which on a summer Saturday afternoon is full of noise and colour and the residual smell of the morning's market, vegetables and flowers and the sweet rot of fruit that didn't sell. And you are passing the entrance to a narrow court when a man comes out of it very fast. He is perhaps 35. He is well dressed in the way that makes you think money without being entirely sure of the source. He's moving very quickly with his head down and he collides with you at full speed, a collision that knocks you sideways into a wall and scatters the small parcel you were carrying. A book, bought at a shop on the Charing Cross Road. "I do beg your pardon," you say, which is the standard English response to being knocked into a wall by someone else. He doesn't stop. He's moving east along the street and you can see, not clearly, this happens in a fraction of a second, that he is frightened. And behind him, 20 feet back, a man in plain clothes is walking very quickly with the specific purposeful tread that you have learned, over these 10 months, to recognise as the tread of a police officer attempting to appear like he is not following someone. You are in a crowd. The crowd is thick. Saturday, summer, Covent Garden. The man who ran into you is already difficult to distinguish from the other people on the street. The officer reaches you. He stops. He looks at you with the specific assessing regard of someone who's been doing this job for a while. Did a man come past you? You have about 3/4 of a second. In 3/4 of a second you think, the man was running. He was afraid. The officer is in plain clothes. The plainclothes officer in this part of London on a Saturday afternoon may be looking for a pickpocket or a murderer or a forger or anyone. This could be anything. You think, or it could be exactly what it looks like. "Several men have come past me," you say. "It's rather a busy street." You say this with the particular slightly confused courtesy of a young man who's done nothing wrong and is mildly puzzled by the question. The officer looks at you for one long second. Then he looks at the crowd. The man who ran into you is not visible. "Thank you," the officer says, and moves on, threading through the crowd in the wrong direction. You stand very still for a moment. Your heart is extremely loud. You pick up the book from the pavement, Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd, the spine slightly scuffed from its fall, and you hold it and breathe. You don't know what happened in that court. You don't know who the man was. You don't know if he was one of you or a pickpocket or something entirely else. You will never know. But you made a choice in 3/4 of a second, and you're standing here holding a scuffed Hardy on a summer Saturday, and nothing has happened to you, and whatever you did or didn't do in that moment, it is done now. You tell Charles about it that Thursday. He's very still while you tell it. Did the officer look at you closely? For about a second. Yes. Did he ask you anything else? No, he moved on. Charles is quiet for a moment. "You were right to do what you did," he says, which is to say nothing that could have been useful, which is all you can do in that situation without knowing the facts. You don't owe anyone specific loyalty in an encounter you weren't party to. But if he was one of us, then you gave him time. That's all you could give him. Whether it was enough, he shrugs. You don't know. I don't know. You made the safest decision available to you in the time you had. "I wasn't even thinking about safety," you say. "Not consciously. I just looked at the man's face and I thought, Exactly, Charles says. That's what it is. 11 months of learning this city and this life. Your instinct made the calculation before your reasoning mind caught up. You drink your bitter. It shook me, you say. Yes, he says, it should. August, the long summer evenings, the city slow and hot and slightly fetid, the smell of the Thames rising at low tide, the streets dusty where the days have been dry. You go to the Crystal Palace one Sunday with Tommy and a man named Bernard who you've met through Tommy, a stonemason, 30 from Bermondsey, with the physicality of his trade and the unexpected gentleness of a man who spends his professional life making things precisely right. The Crystal Palace is extraordinary. It was the original Great Exhibition building from 1851, moved to Sydenham after the exhibition, and turned into a permanent venue. Concerts, exhibitions, events. It stands on a hill south of the river, vast and glittering, a cathedral of iron and glass that looks from a distance like something from a different and more optimistic century. You spend 5 hours there, in a way that is both entirely innocent and entirely the most enjoyable day you've had since coming to London. Walking through the main transept, eating from vendors in the grounds, sitting on the terraced gardens in the afternoon sun watching the fountains, which on this particular Sunday are operating to their full height, great columns of water catching the light. Tommy and Bernard argue about whether the foundations of the exhibition halls are properly engineered and whether the drainage of the grounds is adequate, which is a conversation that is both specific to their professional backgrounds and an extremely good way to spend an afternoon. You sit between them on a bench in the sun and feel something that it takes you a moment to name. Happy. You are happy. Not in spite of everything. In the full knowledge of everything. The Labouchere Amendment and Peter who lost his position, and the man in Covent Garden with the frightened face, and the officer who looked at you for a full second. All of it is still there, still true, and you are sitting in the sun at the Crystal Palace with two men who know what you are and are the same as you, and the fountains are doing their spectacular best, and you are 23 years old, and you have found your people, and you are, in this moment, extremely happy. September. The year is turning again. 11 months. You're becoming a different person from the one who arrived at Euston Station on a grey February morning with a single trunk and a letter for Marchmont and Sons and a boarding house address and nothing else. The difference is not visible. Mr. Simmons and Mr. Davies, when they look at you across the office, see the same junior clerk they've always seen. Quiet, reliable, slightly reserved, good at ledgers. Mrs. Partridge sees the same unremarkable young lodger who pays his rent on the first of the month and doesn't cause trouble. Your family in Leeds, when you write your monthly letter, hears the same careful account of a normal city life. But you know the difference. You know the back room of the Bricklayers Arms and its Thursday regulars. You know Julian's house on Cheney Walk and the pictures on the wall and the piano that Henry plays. You know Charles's dry precision and Tommy's open warmth and Arthur's careful wisdom and William's relentless journalism and Marcus's novels and the half-dozen other lives you've glimpsed through first names only and conversations in warm rooms. You know a language that most of London doesn't know exists. You know a geography that doesn't appear on any map. You have a life. October brings the first proper fog of autumn, the kind that reduces Lamb's Conduit Street to a 50-foot visibility and makes the gaslights into orange blurs and turns the whole city into a series of half-seen shapes that merge and disappear. And in October, the raid. Let me tell you what a raid looks like, because it's important to know, and because what happens that Thursday evening in October is the closest you have come to the thing you've been afraid of for as long as you can remember being afraid of anything. The Metropolitan Police in 1908 conduct periodic operations against what they call known houses of resort. The police are not, in this period, conducting a particularly systematic or intensive campaign. The levels of attention fluctuate with changes in senior officers, political pressures, the occasional moral panic in the press. But they conduct operations, they use informants. Sometimes they act on specific intelligence. Sometimes they simply sweep an area and see what they find. The Bricklayers Arms has operated, as Tommy said, for 12 years under a particular arrangement with a particular sergeant at a particular station. But arrangements change. Sergeants get transferred or retire. A new officer of sufficient enthusiasm can disrupt a carefully maintained equilibrium. What happens on the second Thursday of October 1908 is this. You're in the back room, as usual. It is a good evening. The room is fuller than usual, perhaps 20 people, a good fire, several conversations going at once. Tommy is there, and Charles, and William, and Arthur, and Freddie from his corner. Henry the student is there, looking pleased with himself about something. Bernard from Bermondsey is there, which is slightly unusual. He doesn't come every week. At 9:17, you will remember the time because you had just looked at the clock on the wall thinking about Mrs. Partridge's 11 o'clock rule. The door from the front bar opens with more force than usual. It is not the woman who serves the drinks. It is the barman with the side whiskers, and his face is doing something that faces do when they're required to remain neutral while containing urgent information. "Gentlemen," he says, quietly, very quietly. The room understands immediately. The conversations stop, not at once, but in a rapid wave, like a sound fading. He tips his head toward the front of the building. Someone is already moving. A man you don't know well goes to the door in the far corner of the room. The one that leads, as you now know, through the cellar and up through a hatch into the court that runs beside the building. He opens it without ceremony. He goes through it. Another man follows. The room is moving, but not in panic, in the controlled, rapid way of people who've been told about this possibility and have thought about what to do. Charles is beside you. "The back door," he says very quietly. "Walk, don't run." You go through the cellar door, a steep wooden stair barely lit by one gas bracket at the bottom. The smell of old barrels and coal dust and the particular underground cold that persists even in October. You go down the stair in the dark behind Charles, your hand on the rough wooden rail. At the bottom, concrete floor, barrels, a coal chute in the ceiling. A man ahead of you in the dark is pushing at something. The hatch. It opens into night air, cold and foggy, and you can hear the sounds of the street, muffled by the fog, and somewhere at the front of the building something that might be voices might be the front door opening. Charles is through the hatch. You're through the hatch. You're in a narrow court. Dark. The buildings on either side close enough to touch. The fog reduces visibility to almost nothing. 3 or 4 other men are already here, moving quickly toward the end of the court. "Left," someone says in a low voice, "not toward Lisle Street." You turn left. You walk quickly in the dark. The fog is both obstacle and cover. You can barely see where you're going, but neither can anyone who might be watching. You emerge onto a side street. Other people, ordinary London people on a Thursday evening, hats and coats and the general business of a city at night. You slow to a walk. A normal walk. You don't know who the other men from the back room are around you. They've dispersed into the fog. Charles is beside you. Keep walking, he says. Don't go back to the street, not tonight. What about walk? You walk. You walk for 15 minutes without speaking, through side streets, into the crowds around Leicester Square, through the human noise of a Thursday evening in central London, the music halls emptying, the restaurants busy, the ordinary business of a city that has no idea what just happened around the corner. On the north side of the square, Charles stops. He looks at you. His face is composed. The same composed, slightly distant face he usually wears. But there is something underneath it that you can see, if you know him well enough, which you now do. Something that is shaking slightly and being held very still. Are you all right? He asks. Yes, you say. You think about this. Yes, I think so. Nobody was in the building. We don't know that. Anyone who was in the back room had time. He says it with certainty. The barman gave us enough warning. What was it? What happened? I don't know yet. I'll know by tomorrow. Someone will know. What do we do now? He looks at you with a slight, very slight uplift at the corner of his mouth that could in another mood be a smile. We go home, he says. We go to our separate ordinary rooms in our separate ordinary lives. We don't communicate by writing. We don't go back to Lisle Street for a while. We wait. How long? Until I hear something reliable. He pauses. Go home, Edmund. Have a drink if you can get one quietly. Don't stay out, just go home, you say. Yes. You look at each other for a moment on the north side of Leicester Square in the fog, with the city noise around you and the ordinary world doing its ordinary thing in every direction. Then you pull your coat tighter and you turn north toward Bloomsbury and you walk. The walk home takes 35 minutes. You don't take the direct route. You take the route through quieter streets, through Holborn, through the old lanes of the legal district where the Inns of Court are dark and the Temple is closed, and the only people out are the occasional late-working barrister and the night watchman on his round. You think about the last 11 months. You think about the first time you sat on a bench in Bloomsbury in March and watched people go past and felt completely invisible in the bad way. You think about the steam room on Northumberland Avenue and the narrow corridor, and Charles with his matter-of-fact mention of a pub on Lisle Street. You think about the back room and Tommy's laugh and Arthur's careful silences and William's journalism and Julian's pictures that look rather well in the light. You think about what you almost walked into or didn't walk into and what it would mean if you had. The Labouchere Amendment, 2 years with hard labour. Oscar Wilde, who was dead at 46. You're 23 years old. You think about what you carry with you. The Ellis Spine Inn on the shelf, the knowledge in your body of what you are, the language you've learned and the geography you've mapped, and the lives you've found and the work of keeping this whole double existence coherent and safe. You think about it all, walking through the foggy October streets of London, and then you arrive on Lamb's Conduit Street, and you let yourself in with your key, and you go upstairs, and you sit on your bed in your coat, and you breathe. Mrs. Partridge's landing clock strikes 11. You are exactly on time. The news comes through William 2 days later. Not in person. He sends a note to the boarding house, addressed in a formal hand to Mr. Edmund Ashford. The note itself saying nothing that couldn't have been written by any acquaintance arranging a meeting. Will you be at the Lion's Corner House in the Strand on Saturday at 3? There's something I'd like to discuss. You go. William is at a table near the back, drinking tea with the focused calm of a journalist who has spent time that morning finding out things he'd rather not know. It was a new sergeant, he says, transferred from V Division. He got wind of the arrangement. I don't know how, possibly from someone who was disgruntled about it, possibly just through normal intelligence work. And he decided to act on it without consulting his predecessor. Did anyone? No. Nobody was in the building when they got through the front. The barman had been watching. He's not one of us. He's just a man who runs a pub and has been running that pub for years, and values the backroom's contribution to his income and is not a fool. William drinks his tea. 3 people from the room were apparently seen in the street outside briefly. They were questioned and gave consistent accounts of having been in the area for reasons unrelated to the Bricklayers Arms. Nothing came of it. And the pub itself? The sergeant looked at the back room and found a room with a fire and a few tables, and no evidence of anything unlawful. Because there wasn't any. Because everyone had left and there was nothing to find. You breathe out. Is it over? The sergeant has filed a report noting that the pub requires further observation. William sets down his cup precisely. It means the Bricklayers Arms is gone. Not permanently, not forever, but for a year at least, probably longer. It's not safe. Gone. The room with the fire, Tommy's laugh, Arthur's stillness, William's journalism, the ordinary impossible miracle of 14 people being themselves in the back room of a Soho pub. Where will everyone go? People are friends, William says. He says it with the careful precision of someone communicating in code even in a Lion's Corner house on a Saturday afternoon, even with someone he trusts. The network continues. People find each other. He looks at you. You've been here nearly a year. You know people now. You know places. You have Charles, who's been navigating the city for longer than I have. It's still a loss. Yes, he says. It's still a loss. A pause. I'm writing about it, he says. Not for the newspaper, for, I don't know, something. I'm writing about what this is, what it's like to live this way, about the men I know and the lives they have and the ordinary human decency of it, which the law has decided is criminal and which I find I cannot agree with. Can you publish it? Not now, possibly not ever. He looks at the teacup. But Carpenter publishes. Forster writes. There's an American in Paris. He stops. Things are moving, slowly. In Germany, Hirschfeld has been doing scientific work, petitioning the government. There are people in many countries who've been saying, carefully and loudly and with evidence, that this is not a sickness, not a crime, not a perversion, but simply a way of being human, and that the law is wrong. Do you believe things will change? William is quiet for a moment. Yes, he says. In the long run, yes. I don't know how long the run is. Long enough that I may not see it. He looks at you. You might. You're 23. If the argument makes sufficient progress, if the science accumulates and the people brave enough to make it keep making it, what is sufficient progress? I don't know. I believe sufficient. I believe it happens. I just don't know when. He stands, beginning to put on his coat. Come to Julian's on the 15th. He's hosting a small dinner. He knows what happened at the Bricklayers Arms, obviously. He sends his regards and says it would be good to see people. I'll come, you say? Good. He buttons his coat. Edmund? Yes. You did well. That evening, and the months before it, and in general. He says it simply, the way a journalist says things. You came to a difficult city not knowing anything, and you found your way. That's not nothing. He nods to you and leaves. You sit for a moment in the Lion's Corner house, surrounded by the cheerful Saturday noise of people having tea and doing nothing more complicated than existing in a city on an afternoon in October. Then You order a pot of tea and sit with it and think. November again. You have been at London for 1 year. The Thursday evenings continue, relocated. Not always the same place. Julian's occasionally, Gregory's rooms, a room above a bookshop in Bloomsbury that a man named Philip, new to you, an architect, rents for the purpose, which has the advantage of being lined with books and the disadvantage of having no fire. Sometimes just Charles's flat in St. John's Wood, which is a careful choice on his part because St. John's Wood is wealthy and discreet, and the neighbours are the kind of people who actively don't want to know what their neighbours are doing. The Bricklayers Arms sits empty of its back room, the door into the space that was the back room presumably locked now, the fire unlit, the bench along the wall unoccupied. The room, in your memory, takes on the quality of something lost, not a tragedy. You are, all of you, too pragmatic for it to be a tragedy, but a loss. The specific warmth of a specific place, the smell of beer and coal fire, and the particular human density of 14 men being themselves in a room that allowed it. You carry it with you in the way you have learned to carry everything that belongs to your hidden life, carefully, in a place that doesn't show, available to yourself and invisible to the world. There are things you learn in the months after the Bricklayers Arms that you might not have learned otherwise. You learn that the network is more resilient than it looks, that the loss of any one place does not, in the end, destroy the web that connects the people in it. Tommy finds you through the network within 2 weeks, cheerful and unfazed, with news of a pub in Clerkenwell that has a similar arrangement. Charles reaches out through channels that don't leave traces. William writes his careful notes. Julian's hospitality continues. The people persist. The rooms change. You learn that there are more people than you knew. The Thursday evenings, in their various relocated forms, introduce you to people who were previously nodes in the network you hadn't reached. A doctor from Harley Street, careful and very precise. A teacher at a grammar school who smokes a great deal and talks about the Greeks with the enthusiasm of a man who has found in the classics a personal vindication. A young man from the East End, a warehouseman who comes to his first meeting of any kind via Tommy, and who spends his first evening in a state of dazed disbelief at the room's existence that you recognise with complete clarity, because you spent your own first evening in exactly the same state. His name is Danny. He's 21, he's from Whitechapel, and he grew up in a world where what he is would be, if discovered, if named, a particular kind of catastrophic. He has less protection than you, less money than Charles, less verbal facility than William. He has his trade and his quick intelligence and a quality of stubborn determination that you find, in a way you can't entirely articulate, very moving. You remember what Tommy said in your first conversation on your first Thursday. Once you're in, you're in. You bring Danny in, not by doing anything specific. You're not Charles, not yet practiced enough to be the person who gives directions in a Turkish bath corridor, but by being there, by making the introduction to Tommy, who makes the introduction to others, by being one of the faces that is already familiar when Danny arrives for his second Thursday and his third. It is such a small thing, and you know it is not small at all. Christmas approaches again. You go back to Leeds again. Your mother feeds you. Your father asks about the position. Your sister, who is indeed now planning to come to London in the spring to find work as a typewriter girl, asks everything about the city, and you tell her the things you can tell her. The best route from Euston, the boarding houses in Bloomsbury, the good tea shops and the areas to avoid at night. She says again that you seem different, happier. Yes, you say. I am. She looks at you with those sharp eyes and says, "There are people?" "There are people," you say. "Good," she says, and goes back to her sewing. You think on the train home that she may know more than you've told her, that she may be able to read from the quality of your happiness something of its nature even without the details. You hope she can. You hope that the version of your life she intuits is close enough to the truth to give her what she'd be glad to know. That you're not alone, that you have found people, that you are building something real. New Year, 1909. You are 24 years old. The year that has just ended has been, you try to find the exact and honest word for it, lying in your dipping mattress on the first night of the new year. The city outside making the particular muffled noise of a city that has been celebrating and is now subsiding. The year has been terrifying and joyful and exhausting and illuminating and at constant low-level risk of being destroyed by an Act of Parliament that you didn't pass and had no say in. It has also been the most real year of your life. The bookshelf now has different contents. The Ellis is still there, but joined by Carpenter's Intermediate Sex, which is better, and a volume of Whitman, and a novel that Marcus pressed on you 2 months ago with instructions not to tell him what you think until you've read the whole thing. You've read the whole thing. The instructions were because it contains, in one chapter, a scene that is the most accurate rendering in fiction that you've encountered of what it is to want something that the world around you has decided is wrong. And Marcus knew that when you found it, you would need a moment. The photograph of your mother and sister is still there. The room is still cold and the mattress still dips, and the ceiling stain still doesn't look like a map of anywhere. But you are different from the person who arrived here a year ago with his trunk and his boarding house address and was complete aloneness with the thing he was. The city continues. There is a new dreadnought launched from Portsmouth in January. There is a suffragette arrested in Westminster, and her supporters make a great noise about it. There is a general election coming. The newspapers are full of opinions. The men at Marchmont's talk about tariffs and free trade at lunchtime. You do your work, you cross-reference manifests. You count cotton bales by proxy, in clean columns in a ledger, and you do it well enough that Mr. Marchmont himself says something brief and approving to you in the corridor one Tuesday. You eat Mrs. Partridge's slightly overcooked bacon. You walk London in the evenings, but differently now. Not searching any more, or not only searching, but also simply walking, because you know enough of the city to find pleasure in it, rather than only using it as a map of possible encounters. In February you meet someone. His name is Thomas, not Tommy the carpenter, a different Thomas, a librarian at the British Museum reading room, 27 years old, who comes to a gathering at Gregory's rooms and sits across from you and talks about books for 90 minutes with an attention so complete that you realise eventually that both of you have not spoken to anyone else in the room since the conversation began. You talk about Hardy. You talk about Whitman. You talk about, very carefully, in the way that is practised and safe, what it is to read books as a person like you, looking for yourself in them, and often not finding yourself, and occasionally finding something close, and feeling the impact of it in a very specific place. His eyes are dark and serious, and when he laughs, which he does, at something you say about Hardy's melodrama, his whole face does the thing you watched people's faces do for years from outside, the real laugh, unmonitored. You think, there it is. This is not a love story, or not only that, or at least not the part that matters most right now. What matters is that in February you begin to have a reason to be somewhere specific on Saturday afternoons. Not every Saturday. Thomas works shifts at the reading room but some Saturdays, and that this reason has the quality of something you are not performing. You walk with him in Regent's Park, which you do carefully, in the early afternoon, when the park is full of ordinary people walking ordinary dogs, and you're simply two young men walking and talking, which is what you are and also what you appear to be, and the possibility that this could be seized upon and twisted into something dangerous is real and present and acknowledged between you in the careful way that everything is acknowledged between men who live the way you live, but it doesn't stop you from doing it. The conversation continues, it goes places. About books first, then about lives. About Leeds and Whitechapel, where Thomas is from, the son of a Jewish librarian who taught him to read at 3 and to love reading at 4, and who knows about Thomas in the way your sister perhaps knows about you, without asking and without being told, about the reading room, where he spends his days surrounded by the accumulated human attempt to put words to everything, including the things that currently have no legal words, about the future, obliquely, what it contains for men like them, what could be made of it. Germany, Thomas says one Saturday, Hirschfeld's work. There's a scientific committee that's been petitioning the Reichstag to repeal the relevant paragraph of their criminal code. In Germany they call it paragraph 175, like our section 11. Different in detail, similar in effect. And there are doctors and scientists and lawyers who have been, publicly and with their names attached, arguing for its repeal for decades. Has it worked? Not yet, but it persists. The petition accumulates signatures. The argument is being made. Could it happen here? Thomas is quiet for a moment, watching a child throwing bread to ducks at the edge of the water. There are people here who think it will. Carpenter thinks it will. There are doctors, Havelock Ellis, others, who've been arguing that the law is based on a category error, that what we are is not a disease and not a crime. He pauses. Things change. The law on women changes, or will eventually, or they'll make it change. The law on children changed. The law on workers. The law changes when the argument becomes impossible to ignore. We're not making the argument loudly. We can't afford to make it loudly, not most of us. He turns to you. Some people can. Carpenter can. A few wealthy men who have enough protection. The men who have nothing to lose because they've already decided that being alive in the full sense matters more than being safe in the incomplete sense. Wilde had a lot to lose, you say. Wilde had almost everything. He says it with a recognition that doesn't romanticize. And he lost it all, which is one of the things that makes him both terrible and important. Terrible because it tells you what the full cost can be. Important because someone has to pay that cost publicly for the argument to land, and he paid it. You walk for a while in silence. The park is bright today, a February brightness that doesn't have warmth in it yet but has the quality of light returning. The trees are bare, their branches precise against the grey sky. The ducks are unhurried. 2 women walk past with prams talking about something domestic. A man in a bowler hat walks a terrier with the brisk efficiency of a man with limited time for walking dogs. London in February. The same city that contains Section 11 and the Bricklayers Arms and Julian's house on Cheney Walk, and the plainclothes officers in the parks, and Tommy's laugh, and Arthur's careful silences, and this conversation in this park on this afternoon. It contains all of it simultaneously. You are part of all of it simultaneously. Spring again. Your sister comes to London. She finds a position at a legal firm in Chancery Lane, exactly the kind of position she wanted, and a room in a women's boarding house 3 streets from yours, and she settles in with a speed and competence that makes you think she was always going to do this, and you had nothing to teach her. You have Sunday lunches together at a restaurant in Holborn. You talk about the city. She says, "I've met someone." You say, "Tell me about them." She says, "She's a typewriter girl at the same firm. She's from Edinburgh. She reads Wollstonecraft." You say nothing for a moment. Then you say, "I'd like to meet her." Your sister looks at you, the sharp-eyed look. "I thought you might say that," she says. A pause. "You know, then," you say. "I've always known," she says, "or suspected, since you were about 15 and you used to read in your room rather than come to the neighbours, and you had a particular way of looking at. Anyway, yes, I've always known." "Does mother?" "No. Father certainly not." She picks up her teacup. "But I do." A silence. "Is it?" she asks carefully. "Are you—" "I found people," you say. "I told you that, at Christmas. I found people, and I have a life, a real life. It's complicated, and there are things about it that are—" You stop. "It's real. That's the main thing." She nods. She doesn't look at you with pity, which you appreciate more than you can say. She looks at you with the expression of someone who was worried and has received the news that the worrying can stop. "Good," she says. "I'm glad." She drinks a tea. "The same applies to me," she says. "What I've told you. The same. It's complicated and there are things about it. But it's real." "I'm glad," you say. You look at each other across the table in a restaurant in Holborn on a Sunday afternoon in April. Two Ashfords from Leeds, both of you carrying your particular secrets, both of you having found your particular London lives, both of you in the middle of something you didn't quite plan and wouldn't trade. "Neither of us told Mother," she says. "No." She'd be, "Yes, eventually." You consider. Eventually she'd be fine, I think. She just needs time. Time, you agree. You order pudding. You talk about other things. Outside, London does what London does, continues, enormous and indifferent and full of rooms and lives, and the human project in all its forms, including the ones that have had to build themselves in corners and back rooms and private dinners and careful coded languages, including specifically yours. Summer again. The second summer. The evenings are long. After work you walk, sometimes with Thomas, sometimes alone, sometimes with whoever among the network is free on a given evening. The city is lighter in every sense, physically, with the long evenings, and in some other sense that you don't want to make too much of, because the danger is still there, the law hasn't changed, the plainclothes officers are still in the parks. But the evenings are long. You've been here for 1.5 years. You know the city. The cotton manifests and the bills of lading and the freight documents of Marchmont and Sons. The Thursday evenings wherever they are currently meeting. Julian's Chelsea house and Gregory's Bloomsbury rooms, and Charles's St. John's Wood flat, and Philip the architect's book-lined room. Thomas on Saturday afternoons in the park, or over tea in a Lyons, or walking along the embankment watching the Thames. Tommy and Bernard and Arthur and William and Marcus and the others, the names and faces of the network, first names only. The accumulated warmth of people who have found each other in a city that would rather they hadn't. Danny from Whitechapel, who came to his third Thursday with a copy of the Carpenter pamphlet that William had lent him, and who read it, apparently 3 times, and who said to you afterward, in the careful, understated way of someone processing something large, "I didn't know anyone had written it down." "I didn't know either," you said, "until someone told me." He nodded, then, "Thank you, for—" He stopped. "You're in," you said. "That's all it is. Once you're in, you're in." He nodded again, and something in his face did the thing you recognise. The thing you've seen in mirrors and other faces, the easing of the monitoring apparatus, the very small adjustment of someone being seen for the first time. This is what you are in the summer of your second year in London. You're a junior clerk at Marchmont and Sons of Fenchurch Street, earning 32 shillings a week, reliable and quiet and good at ledgers. You live in a room in a boarding house on Lamb's Conduit Street, Bloomsbury, run by Mrs. Partridge, who remains neutral in her commercial regard and who is, as far as you know, completely unaware that on Thursday evenings and some Saturdays and certain other occasions you're living a life that is technically, under the terms of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, a criminal offence. You have learned a city. You have found a network. You have found people, which is the word you use to your sister and the right word. You carry the Labouchere Amendment with you every day in the way that background radiation is always present, unpleasant and invisible and real. You are careful. You know what careful means, which is less a set of rules than a disposition, a constant low-level alertness, the habit of monitoring the space between yourself and the world. And you have, within those constraints, built something real and specific, and yours. There is a particular evening you carry in your memory, a Thursday evening in October, the 2nd October, the week before the anniversary of the Bricklayers Arms raid. You are at Philip's room above the bookshop, which has by this point a fire going and a sufficient density of accumulated Thursday evenings to have taken on some of the warmth of the old room on Lisle Street, and the room is full. Tommy and Arthur and William and Charles and Henry and a few others you've come to know. And someone has brought a bottle of wine, which is unusual but welcome, and there is a conversation going about the suffragette demonstration in Parliament Square last week, and whether the women's cause and the cause of people like you are related, and in what ways. Carpenter thinks so, William says. The intermediate sex, as he calls it, and the women who demand their rights, they're both, he argues, part of the same movement away from the Victorian arrangements that required everyone to fit specific categories. The Victorians required everyone to be legible, Charles says, legible and fixed. Man of a specific kind, woman of a specific kind, relationships of a specific kind. Anything that didn't fit was pathological. And now? Henry asks. And now it's still illegal, Tommy says, which gets a laugh. Progress is very gradual, Arthur says from his usual chair, with his usual whisky and his usual exactness. I have watched it progress very gradually for a long time. Will we see it? Henry says. He is 20 now, and the question has the particular urgency of 20. Will we see the law change? In our lifetimes? A silence. Honestly, William says, I don't know. Not soon. The war in Europe. There's going to be a war in Europe if Hirschfeld and the Germans can see what I think I can see. Wars make things worse, not better for people like us. Patriotism, conformity, the closing of ranks. You're very cheerful, someone says. I'm a journalist. Being cheerful is not my function, but, he pauses, I believe it happens, in the end. The argument is being made and it's the right argument, and eventually right arguments win. Wilde, Henry says. Wilde paid for it, William says. We carry him. We carry him because he existed and because he paid, and because his words are still in the language whether the language knows it or not. A silence. Arthur from his chair says, I came to the first Thursday evening at the Bricklayers Arms 12 years ago. I was 39 years old. I had been carrying this for 24 years. He says it with the flat precision of a man giving evidence. I was told about the room by a man whose name I've forgotten, in a place I won't name. I walked into it and found what you found, what all of you have found, a room of people being themselves. He drinks his whiskey. I have been coming, one way or another, for 12 years, through 3 locations, through 1 raid that I was absent for and 2 I was present for, through the loss of people who left or were driven out or, he stops, through a great deal, and I am still here. A pause. That is my contribution to the question of whether we will see change. I am still here. The room is quiet. Then Tommy says, "So am I." "So am I," Charles says. "So am I," says William. "So am I," you say. Around the room, the same words, in different voices, in the warm, book-lined October room above a bookshop in Bloomsbury. So am I. Let me tell you the last thing before you sleep. The last thing is this, that the life you have built in this year and a half of London is built in the space between what is and what ought to be, which is where all interesting lives are built. It is not the life that would require no secrecy, no double existence, no back rooms and private dinners and locked doors. That life does not exist, not yet. Not in 1908 or 1909 in England, not for men like you. The life you have is the one that has been built inside the constraints that exist, using the tools available, the network, the careful language, the trusted faces, the Thursdays, to make something real inside the impossible. Tommy the carpenter builds in stone. Julian builds in hospitality. William builds in words. Arthur builds in simple endurance. You are building with the materials of your particular life. 1 ledger, 1 boarding house room, 1 city learned on foot. The thing that every person builds when they decide that being alive in the full sense matters more than being safe in the incomplete sense. The thing is yourself. It is November again. Your room is cold, and the mattress dips, and the ceiling has its stain. Outside, London is doing what London does. The late trams, the distant sound of voices from the pub on the corner, hooves still on the wet cobblestone somewhere, the gas lamp making its circle of orange outside the window. You have been here for nearly 2 years. You pull the thin blanket up. You think about the room above the bookshop, the fire and the wine and the first names in the warm air, Thomas on Saturday in the park talking about Whitman, your sister on her Sunday lunches talking about Edinburgh, Tommy with his laugh, Arthur with his whiskey and his 12 years and is still here. The city outside continues, exactly as it always does, enormous and indifferent and full of rooms and lives. You are one of those lives. You are warm enough, safe enough, fed enough. You have people, that's the word, people. In a city of 4 million, you are not alone. The gas lamp outside makes it circle. The horse is somewhere else now. The pub quiets. The argument is being made, slowly, carefully, by men like Carpenter and Hirschfeld and Ellis and others whose names you don't yet know, in languages you don't speak, in rooms you'll never visit. The argument is being made that what you are is not a sickness, not a crime, not a perversion, but a human thing. The law will change, not tomorrow, not in any tomorrow you can clearly see from here, but there will be a tomorrow, and the argument will have been made longer by then, and the people will still be there, still finding each other in the careful sideways way, still building their back rooms and their private dinners and their Thursday evenings, and still saying every Thursday, in every room, to everyone who arrives with the new face and the looking for something expression. You're in. Once you're in, you're in. That will still be true. That has always been true. The city is quiet now. Somewhere, a clock, 11, 12, an hour you're too tired to count. Let sleep take you the way it took Edmund in his attic room on Lamb's Conduit Street more than 100 years ago, while London turned around him and the argument continued and the network held and the rooms went dark one by one until morning. Let the world fade. Let the noise quiet. Let your thoughts slow and soften and finally stop. You are warm enough, safe enough, held enough. Tomorrow there'll be more of everything. The difficulty and the warmth of it, the danger and the joy of it, the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of people finding each other in a world that would rather they didn't. But that's tomorrow. Right now there is just this. The dark of the room, the sounds of the city, fading, the slow drift towards something that is not forgetting but is very like rest. Everything that happened today stays. Every room you sat in, every name you learned, every word spoken in the warm, careful dark. You carry it. You're carrying it right now into sleep. Let it be enough. Good night.